Tambi. Now that the elections are done with, it's time to look forward to what we can expect in our country. What are the developments? And I'm not talking about the economic developments, but the social developments. How are we going to see this system change happening? What about elements such as transparency, reconciliation, accountability, human rights, the many emblematic cases which we expect to be solved, the many laws which need to be either repealed or changed, amended, so much to be done, and what's going to happen. And to discuss all this, I have with me Bhavani Fonseka, Senior Researcher at the Center for Policy Alternatives, who is, of course, also an attorney at law. Welcome and good evening, Bhavani.
Hello, Niresh.
Nice to have you after quite some time, I think. Right, so Bhavani, now we've been in this ruckus of elections for the last, goodness knows, 6, 7, 8 months. And the government itself is about 6 months old now. And hopefully the elections are behind us. I know there's still a lot of horse dealing going on to actually capture power within certain local government authorities and so on. But hopefully in a couple of weeks that will end. And then we can actually get down to the important stuff in the country. What are our priorities? What does the government need to move on?
So, Niresh, thank you first for having me. I think this is an important question in terms of where Sri Lanka is. We've had, as you said, 3 elections. And I think it's very important to say at the outset, we have to have a 4th election, the provincial council elections, but we've had 3. And I think this election was a bit different to the others in many respects. I think we can unpack that in the program. But this has been also 6 months into this government, forming a government, a cabinet in November. And I think it's very important to look at the promises made in 2024. What's the status? Has there been any major delivery in these areas? What's the status in terms of the questions you raised? But also we are coming up to 16 years after the end of the war. I think that also needs reflection in terms of where is this country in terms of reconciliation, reckoning. And I would say, considering all of that, there's more questions than actual answers from this government. And I don't think we can call it a new government anymore. The president has been in office since September, the prime minister and the cabinet since November. And really, I think now there has to be these tough questions asked. What's the plan? How do you plan to do it? What's the timeline? And how do you connect with the voters, with the citizen? And sadly, I think the election results speak to a lot of frustration, disappointment among the vote base in terms of lack of progress. So I think that's something to think about.
Now, in marketing terms, when you're embarking on a project, you have to show a timeline. You have to say, okay, next month, step 1, this is going to happen, and who's going to be responsible. Step 2, 3 months from then, and so on until completion. That's the way you do any kind of project. So it doesn't matter in which field this is. This could be, you're constructing a highway or a dam. You need to have the time plan. If you're going to bring in a new law, you have to have a timeline. Otherwise, it doesn't work. It's simply castles in the air. It's just a wish list of things that you'd like to do, and you may even tell a few people to work on it, but you have to give them a time plan. And we're not seeing that from this government so far, are we?
Not as far as we've seen or publicly available. Maybe the government has their own time plans, which they may be talking among themselves, but that also speaks to a problem. How do you communicate? How is the transparency of this government? So I think those are questions I think we need to ask in terms of how do you plan to deliver on this very ambitious set of proposals, this A Thriving Nation, A Beautiful Life that came out in August 2024.
I notice you have the manifesto
yes, I
in
thought
front of you.
it's quite important we look at their own language without us saying, we think they said it. Let's look at their own language. And it sounded great. It captured the imagination in 2024. People got excited. I think there's still quite a bit of excitement that, there is now a moment. And I think it's very important. The president also has reminded us that they have a 2/3 mandate. So considering all of that, ambitious proposals, a 2/3 mandate, what's the problem? Why have these things not happened? So you're quite right. A timeline, information, all of that is important. In the absence of that having happened in 6 months, then questions need to be asked is then why did it not happen? Who is responsible? And is there going to be a reset in terms of the government's own plan and how they plan to move forward after this cycle of elections now?
Now, let's take one of the key words here, accountability. We don't see a lot of that happening. I mean, we generally in Sri Lanka, we don't see accountability at all. It's always something happens and a committee is appointed, then that committee in 3 months' time will give a report and recommendations, and those things are half of it may be implemented, but there's no accountability. No one is held to account when something actually goes wrong. And I was just thinking about, in the last few days, we have had so many buses and vans, commuter vehicles, which have plunged down cliffs, ravines, and so many people have lost their lives. And we tend to say, oh, and it was an accident, they ran off the road, but it's actually not so. These are buses which are not fit for the road, and I think today the National Transport Commission has made a statement that most of the buses or a large number of the buses on the road are not actually fit for public usage. So who's accountable? And now you can't say that okay, it's the previous government, because now we have a National Transport Commission, we have a Transport Ministry, we have so many organizations which should be accountable for this. You can't just blame the bus driver or the bus owner. Yes, they are at fault, but then the authorities, what are they doing? So this whole spirit of accountability simply hasn't sunk in, has it?
No, but I think let's give some credit in terms of, I think the government has brought in this realization that, this former mode of governance in terms of corruption, in terms of nepotism, that has no place in Sri Lanka. This kind of the system change people demanded said no to that. And I feel in the 6 months we've seen some semblance of a different way of working in terms of, you can't just get away by having your relatives or your friends in particular places, or you pay someone a bribe and can do something. I think that form of governance, at least so far, we haven't seen that. And I think that needs to be recognized. But accountability and governance, it's much bigger than that. I don't think one can say just because there's no known corruption, this is all hunky-dory. I think the whole point and promises were made in terms of addressing particular cases, emblematic cases, cases such as Lasanta's case, Prageet's case, I mean journalists, I think questions need to be asked why there hasn't been progress, at least in the public realm. Nothing is known. A couple of months ago, earlier this year, I think we remember the huge uproar when the Attorney General tried to withdraw charges around some of these cases, and the President had a meeting, questions were asked, and I believe even the minister has come on your show and said they're going to set up a public prosecutor. So, promises were made. 6 months down the road, the question is, we haven't seen progress. Now, there is also the other dimension of accountability in terms of service delivery, not just in the transport sector, which I think, what we are seeing is shocking. And I think the President, the Minister, the government needs to take responsibility. You cannot keep blaming previous governments, whatever their faults, and there were many faults. You can't keep blaming them. You've been in office, you have the mandate, do something. But I think there's also other areas where people are affected, such as if you look at the rising numbers of cases of dengue and chikungunya, the whole issue of where is the health sector? What are they doing? Are citizens feeling secure in this country? So from health to transport, there are many aspects where accountability of the government needs to be asked. I think one can also raise the question in terms of increasing crime numbers, and the government has admitted there is a spate of cases which is alarming. Is the government not in control? Why is it not in control? I think, so there is a whole array of questions that need to be asked in terms of governance, in terms of corruption. Yes, some things are different, but not enough. And what is this problem that we're facing? Now, I think it's also important to ask very particular questions in terms of structural and legislative reforms. One being, why is the government dragging its feet in a promised public prosecutor's office? Some will say, well, now there's a committee set up headed by a Supreme Court justice. Granted, that has happened. Why did it take so long? That promise was made in August 2024. Why is it dragging so long? Why is there no information on this? What are the pushbacks from different actors for not implementing these things? So I hope you're able to get the government and ask these questions. We will be also asking, we will be putting out something in terms of a scorecard on these areas. And I have to say, Niresh, I haven't seen much hope in terms of what has been achieved so far.
Well, that's what's troubling, that people are losing faith simply because you don't see the progress. But perhaps there is progress, as you said, behind the scenes. Perhaps there is a time plan, but then there's a dearth in communication at that point. We don't get enough information out of the ministries, out of even the President's office. I mean, it's lovely to have all these, what the President's doing, where he's going, all that, but exactly, the policy steps that he is implementing, we don't see that. It's not transparent enough. Perhaps it's just that they don't have the personnel and they don't understand that they need professional communicators to communicate these things, but it's as if there is a mist, a fog around what may be actually happening.
But what's interesting, Niresh, is I have to say, when the NPP was in opposition, they were very good in communication. So what happened when they went to government, so they had an excellent communication strategy. They connected with the people. I mean, what happened in September, what happened in November was largely due to personalities, communication strategy. Of course, one can also say the opposition being in disarray and continue to be in disarray. But The government had a very good communication strategy when they were in opposition. They were able to articulate their positions, challenging things. When they stood with us challenging the proposed ATA or the proposed OSA, they were able to articulate that. Now they seem to not just be able to not communicate, they seem to have reversed their positions. So from a group that opposed the ATA, challenged the ATA bill, challenged the OSA bill, opposed both those laws, the whole point was repeal PTA and replace it. We now have a government that has kept using the PTA multiple times. Most recently, a youth who was pasting a sticker was detained under the PTA. And the question is, what is the security aspect of arresting someone for pasting a sticker? But this government was very clever in communicating, in opposing the use of the PTA before they joined government, but now seems to have an inability to say, okay, what is your next plan? Interestingly, with the OSA, they opposed it, they challenged it, but a few weeks ago we saw an opposition member of parliament put in a private member's bill to repeal the OSA. But why didn't the government do that? So, there are lots of questions as to why the communication strategy.
Repeal it and bring in a new law with regard to anti-terrorism. But again, there is no time plan, and while we are waiting, we see the PTA being applied, like you said, on rather strange and frivolous cases where the penal code would suffice. So somebody pasting a sticker, for goodness sake, that's not a terrorist. It is not an act of terrorism. Terrorism is threatening to blow up something, or threatening to assassinate somebody, threatening the security of the state. Pasting a sticker is not it. When you go back to 88, 89, the JVP itself was pasting posters all over the country. So the actual pasting is not the terrorism. It's when you actually you're conspiring or you're planning to commit an act of terror. That's terrorism. So we seem to have sort of got lost in the semantics of it.
Yeah, but I think what needs to be also asked is, why is this government dragging their feet on this, or are they listening to elements who want the PTA to be used, who want the PTA to be on as a piece of law, or what is holding them back? Now, if the president keeps reminding the voter, the citizen, that they have a 2/3, what's holding them back in pushing forward?
And it's not just the president. We hear this
lots of people.
Yes.
I think, unfortunate that we see so many get on stages and platforms and remind this, but start delivering. But I think they also keep using this excuse of, we have a committee set up. We have a committee now to look at the whole PTA and bringing proposed laws. But that committee also has been there for several months now. What has the committee done? What's the issue here? If the committee is headed by a senior president's council who was set up several months ago, have they given anything to the minister? Is the minister then able to come and share publicly, okay, this is the plan. By this time, we're going to do this. Are we going to engage with the different stakeholders? And also keeping in mind, I don't think some of these laws, which have been discussed for a long time, or law reforms, require a whole lengthy process, because we had the CTA in 2018, 2019, we had the ATA after that. There's been a lot of discussion. What needs to happen now is action. Now, previous governments, one can say they didn't have the 2/3. So they got stuck in that legislative reform process. This government has the 2/3. They have promised it. So they really can move forward if they want to. But so the inaction raises question, are they just happy to just go along and not do much? But I think the voter has sent a very strong message in terms of the election results that they can't continue like this. And then the question is, if they're unable to deliver, who is going to gain out of all of that? And that's also raising very many questions.
Yes, there does seem to be a weakening of the position of the NPP, and this is just 6 months into the government. So it's something that certainly the NPP needs to take cognizance of and act more decisively. And as we are reminded so often, they have the 2/3. So now in the past, of course, ruling parties had this problem of perhaps they can't get something through Parliament, especially if it requires 2/3. But now you don't have that. I mean, just put it on the order paper and
go through the process.
Don't
process. Rush.
Yes, but once it gets to Parliament, it doesn't get delayed. It shouldn't get, simply because let the opposition have their say and then pass it.
Well, I think, if anything, with the OSA and the ATA examples most recently, but there are many others, one can say the law reform process shouldn't be pushed through to serve political agendas. I think we've had these conversations in this show and other shows in terms of how problematic, for example, the OSA, that process happened in such a short time period. So if the government is genuine in getting through some of these laws, do it properly, but communicate to the people. There's nothing to bar them. The president can go to Parliament and say, this is our legislative agenda. This is our timeline. This is what we would like to do. So there's no secret about it. Everyone's put on notice. Okay, you want to have a committee on particular things? Do that. But don't drag your feet so that 1 year into the presidency of Anurakkumara Dissanayake, we all come and say, oh, but they still haven't delivered, Now they've got notice from the people. People have said, do better. So what's the plan for the next 6 months? What's the plan for the next year? I think those questions need to be asked, but those questions need to be grappled by the government. We can keep asking these questions, but they need to be able to engage. They need to be able to communicate.
Now, one thing that we see with many successive governments is they say, whenever an issue is raised, they say, oh, we're appointing a committee, or we appointed a committee, and that is sort of the de facto action. But to the public, a committee means nothing. It's just fobbing off the issue, when the committee members themselves may be actually working very hard and coming up with the solution. But when the feeling is, oh, another committee, they're just going to sweep everything under the carpet. And this is a problem, isn't it? Because we are never told a committee has been appointed and it must report back within 3 months, and then at that 3-month stage we are not shown the committee report and told, okay, these recommendations will be implemented. So there's an issue in the process there.
Well, Sri Lanka unfortunately has this culture of appointing commissions, committees, task forces, not just this government, previous governments. I think a particular government had this tendency for everything. There was a task force appointed.
Presidential commission.
Presidential commission, presidential task force. And what's worrying with all these initiatives is those questions of accountability and transparency. How do they function? Who are they accountable to? And as you rightly said, I'm not saying some of the people heading these committees and commissions don't have the expertise. Some of them are very experienced, they know the topic, but there is a communication information gap here that we don't know what's going on. And especially those that have been appointed for several months, I think it's incumbent on this government now to say, we appointed XYZ a couple of months ago, this is the status, so that they address these concerns, they address some of the questions that have been asked, and that I think will be an answer to the people. That's the difference from the previous governments, because previous governments didn't care, and then we know what happened to them. If this government takes note of this election result, of how the voter has tried to raise these concerns, I think hopefully they take note, and at least someone comes and says, okay, 6 months we've done this is what's happened, next month, 6 months, we are going to do these things, and we want to engage with these people. So hopefully one hopes that there is now an idea to change certain practices. I hope that happens.
That's sound advice indeed. We're going to take a short commercial break right now. Don't go away, we'll be right back.
Two long, hard years of work, winning test matches all around the world has gone into this.
And he can shift the game on a dime.
Game on!
There's fire, there's always a little bit of drama as well.
That's a catch for the ages in the ultimate test match.
They just keep coming. This game...
Welcome back to Face to Face. I'm in conversation with Bhavani Fonseka, attorney at law and senior researcher at the CPA. Bhavani, let's talk about the big elephant in the room, reconciliation. We're a couple of days away from the 16th anniversary of the end of the war. 16 years and nothing concrete has been done. we've had so many governments up to now, so many different departments, officers appointed. Nothing really concrete has actually happened. The same issues are still there for 16 long years. What needs to be done now to put this issue to bed, to rest, end it, or at least show that something has been done?
Again, Neeraj, I think the question is, when this government was voted in 2024, in September and November, they got massive votes from the north and east, from the minority communities, unprecedented for any southern party. And I think people in those areas, especially the war affected, I think, were saying what has been there before, including the Tamil parties, hadn't delivered. We wanted a change. And I think many, if you looked at the campaigns, the crowds that President Dissanayake was able to gather at his campaign rallies in these areas, spoke to a fact that they felt this individual, this party was able to change, break from the past. And I think listening to that as well, the manifesto also spoke to certain things. There was a recognition that past abuses needed to be addressed. Reconciliation needed to be there. Not just what happened during the war, but one of the big promises was addressing the Easter Sunday attacks and bringing accountability. So 16 years after the war, one raises, asks the question, have they able to start this process? Have they able to address some of the grievances the people were speaking to? And, you know, while as a lawyer I'll say, okay, you need to pass these laws, you need to have these structures, these are all important. But very fundamentally, there has to be confidence building. There has to be trust. People need to be able to trust this government. And those confidence building measures the government could have done. Some they promised but didn't deliver, raises that question. And I think the results, at least from the north and east, is indicative people have lost trust. They don't think this government is able to deliver on those key fundamental asks in terms of reconciliation, in terms of accountability. So if you look at it, the government said repeal PTA. Hasn't happened. If anything, PTA is being used multiple times. Releasing political prisoners. Really, there are still questions on that. They spoke about land issues. What we are seeing is there was some land released last year, and one raises the question, yes, it was around the election time, so it was seen as an election gimmick, opening a road in Jaffna, all of that. But really, what about the rest of the areas? There's large areas occupied, land occupation by state entities. That hasn't happened. If anything, what we've seen in recent weeks is land conflicts in some of these areas where minorities have been using, cultivating land, is still under severe strain. Because you still have the archaeology department, you have the wildlife department, you have Buddhist monks who feel it's their right to go and occupy this. These conflicts can't be resolved quickly, but the government needs to take a very clear stand that they are aware, they're listening, they want to address these root causes of the conflict. That hasn't happened. If anything, we see just days prior to the election, a gazette being issued for the northern province, which affects 5 districts in that area, where there's a notice saying in 3 months, if people don't claim abandoned land, that it will be taken by the government. That sends alarm bells among people in those areas who
in any area.
In any area,
if that
but
happened here in the Western
any
province,
area, I mean,
you'd be
land,
alarmed.
yes, everyone will be alarmed. But the way this happened, in an area where people have been displaced multiple times, some don't have documentation, some had to flee the country and haven't been able to return. Now, how are these people meant to go and suddenly in 3 months claim this land or show documentation? And it raises questions. When the government promised so much in 2024, why are these things happening? So, in terms of those trust building measures, there's been very disappointing progress or any progress. And then you get to the bigger questions of, they said they're going to address accountability. They said they'll address impunity with cases from the war, but also Easter Sunday attacks, also corruption cases. The continuum of impunity is not just human rights cases or what happened during the war, it's the ongoing nature of it. Nothing really has happened. So what's the problem here? Is it, as many have said, delays with investigations, prosecutions? If so, their own promises speak to some reforms that should be happening. So we come back to the whole point of, there is impunity, there is lack of progress with accountability, trust building measures, confidence building measures are sorely lacking. If anything, they're backtracking on some of these things, sending the wrong message. And so, I think it's again a moment. I hope the government this weekend on Sunday sends a very strong message saying, we are different, we will do something. This is not
But the proof of the pudding is in the eating.
Exactly, and we haven't seen it yet. But let's see what happens over the next few days at least to start the process. I think it's important for them to realize this is a moment, 16 years after the war, there needs to be a change. You cannot just say there are no minorities in this country. You cannot say this is an economic issue alone. There are root causes to this conflict. There's the call for a political solution is decades long. You can't sweep it under the carpet and say, we got a mandate only to address economic issues. No, you have to tackle all of these things. And a government with a 2/3 should do much more than what they have done so far.
Now, when you take, let's address this this gazette which came out. We in Sri Lanka, some of us call it the land of the midnight gazette, because one of the first things some of us journalists do when we get into office in the morning is check the government printer's website to see what's come out in the middle of the night, because it could be prices being raised, tariffs, whatever, or it could be something very serious, dealing with land and so on. And it takes a while to read through the gazette and figure out the impact of it. Now, this is the wrong process, isn't it? A government, when they take such any type of decision, they need to explain it to the people. That's the spirit of openness, not just put it in the gazette and then say, oh, this is happening.
And I think you're quite right in terms of, we've had times where gazettes came out so fast we couldn't keep track of it. And some of us have got used to reading gazettes and understanding, okay, these are the legal implications, these are the political implications. I don't know if everyone who's going to be affected by this gazette in particular is able to get access to this gazette, understand its implications. So it raises, just an example I use there, but it raises so many fundamental problems that while there is some changes in terms of lack of major corruption or nepotism, this government is going down the same path in terms of operating, in terms of functioning, by issuing a gazette and not communicating to the people what it means. There is a problem there. And for many, during an election time, there's so much noise, this could be missed. Luckily, it was highlighted by some local media and local politicians in those areas, which raised alarm bells. And that's why I think now there's at least some discourse. But I don't think the government has publicly come out yet to explain why they're doing it. And it's been now more than a few weeks. So I hope now is the time in the northern province, the Minister of Land or the President himself, I mean, they all went to the north during the election campaign, all three campaigns. You saw the President, you saw the Prime Minister, you saw key members of Parliament and key members of Cabinet going. But there's silence when there's something that is fundamentally change that landscape and possibly rob people of their heritage, of their livelihood. So it has huge implications. And I don't know, Niresh, I mean, 16 years after the war, one would think we have all reflected on what led to this conflict or the cycles of conflict.
But have we? Really? I mean, you and I have, but have the politicians done so? And the general public, I don't think even is aware. I mean, the younger generations, they don't even know what led to the conflict, the many decades before the actual fighting broke out. So the root causes have not been dealt with, have not been even discussed.
I agree. There is a lack of awareness among sections of the society, including my own, the majority community, who lives in a rather bubble in terms of thinking 16 years after the war, everything is fine. The fact that it was the economic crisis and a governance crisis that got people to the streets was remarkable. But many in the north and east, mothers of the disappeared, those who've been affected by land grabs, were protesting for years, for decades. So I think though I'll say there is a slight awakening among sections saying, you know, there are problems in this country, we need to address it. And I think from 10 years, 5 years ago to now, there is a greater engagement by certain sections of society. It's incumbent on all of us to raise these issues. And I think it's important at this moment to ask this government, who promised so much, who's supposed to do things differently, ask the questions, why are you still continuing in this? Why is, for example, still problems in Mullaitivu, in this area called Kurundumale, where farmers, minority farmers who've been cultivating that land for years, unable to do it because their paddy land is being restricted? Why are communities, minority communities in the east, not able to enjoy their land when the majority community doesn't seem to have the same problems? Now, I'm not saying you give priority to one community or the other, but you need to show that this country has had so many problems. There are root causes that require attention immediately, that shouldn't be sustained. But there needs to be leadership by the President, by the Prime Minister, by this government to say, we are different to previous governments. We will do better. They need to be telling the people in the north and the east, we came to you during election time. We spoke on these great platforms. We are now coming to you after elections because we want to hear what you say, but deliver. That unfortunately hasn't happened. But not just the key cabinet members, I think members of parliament of the NPP needs to be able to connect with their own voters. I think the fact that the communities in these areas voted differently compared to November, compared to September, is an indicator they are no longer believing the rhetoric. They need to see tangible change on the ground. And I think not just North and East, across the country, from addressing health concerns to transport issues to crime rate, this government needs to show that they're listening to the voter and they have a plan.
And sometimes it seems almost anecdotal. We saw on the Batalanda issue there was a hue and cry in Parliament, in media, publicly. There was so much raised on it, and of course it all started with the former President Ranil Wickremesinghe's interview on Al Jazeera. So he opened the Pandora's box, but then over the past couple of weeks it's died down. We don't see or we're not really told well what's going to happen, not just on Batalanda but on so many torture camps which are known, mass graves around the country which are known, in the south, in the around all over northeast, Matale, and so on. I mean, there was a mass grave found in the port of Colombo, last year. What happened to that? We're not, there doesn't seem to be any progress on these.
So I think, I again, the whole issue of the Batalanda Commission is an indicator as to some of the challenges in getting answers, but also getting accountability. And one thing the government promised was setting up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, personally, for me and from CPA, we have critiqued this idea of a TRC, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The previous government, Ranil Wickremesinghe's government, came up with a bill, and people, especially victims of civil society, all ask, why do we need another commission? And I ask again from this government, while you haven't made any progress with it, why do you think that was even a good idea at that time? But there is this whole issue of there are commission reports like the Batalanda Commission report and other commission reports which state provide answers. So then the question is, what is the accountability that happens based on that information, but also are there changes in terms of the structures? I mean, Batalanda Commission not just raised the issue of political structures in place, but also the security apparatus, the need for security sector reform. Again, not new issues here. This has been there for several years. Is there security sector reform? Is there demilitarization? Large tracts of land, for example, in the north is occupied by military forces. Is there thinking on those lines? So accountability is not just filing cases, and that's a problem, but it's also addressing other issues. So again, so much I think that can be done, and let's see if at least in the next few days this government comes up with a plan, information as to what has happened, things they spoke publicly. Batalanda Commission, I believe they made a lot of noise around. Then they sent the report to the Attorney General's department. But what has happened now? Few weeks later, can someone in the government come and say, this is what we're going to do? Fine, let the prosecution, the investigations, if that's happening, let that happen. But what are the other aspects of it? What are the structural changes that will happen? So with all of this, we come back to the whole thing of there are a whole spate of issues they promised, but we have yet to see. And I think we also need to, at this moment, say, under this government, we've also seen custodial deaths. We've seen cases of torture in police custody. Now, are there things that will happen to change that? Those are things that don't require massive reforms. Custodial death has no place in a democracy. What is this government doing? And I haven't seen anything on those areas either. So much the government can do, but maybe in the next few days, I hope there is something more.
Well, we certainly hope so, and we look forward to seeing some firm time plans where all these steps are concerned, all these promises that we expect, that the public expects delivery on. And I'm afraid we are now out of time, unfortunately. My thanks to Bhavani Fonseka, a senior researcher at the CPA and attorney at law, for being with us this evening. Thank you, Bhavani.
Thank you.
And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.